My parents gave everything to my brother, then they came begging. Hi, welcome back to my channel. Please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon for upcoming more interesting videos.
My name is Megan Turner. I am 31 years old and I live in Phoenix, Arizona. And for most of my life, I believed something was wrong with me because no matter how hard I tried, I never seemed to be. Enough for my parents growing up in our house. There were only 2 children, my younger brother Kyle and me. And from the time, we were little, the difference in how we were treated was obvious to everyone. Except the 2 people who created it, our parents always said they loved us equally. But their actions told a completely different story. Kyle was the center of attention, the one they praised, the one they protected, and the one they always believed in even when he gave them every reason not to. While I was the child expected to be responsible, quiet, and independent from a very young age, I learned quickly that if something needed to be done in the house, it would be my job: dishes, cleaning, helping with errands, and watching Kyle. Whenever our parents were busy, it was not that I hated helping, but it was the way it was expected of me. While Kyle was never asked to do the same things, when he forgot his homework, our parents blamed the teacher. When he got in trouble at school, they said the other kids were a bad influence. And when he wasted money or broke something expensive, they just laughed it off and said boys would be boys. Birthdays and holidays made the difference even more obvious. Kyle always received the newest gadgets, expensive gifts, and endless praise, while I was told that practical presents built character. I remember once saving money from a small weekend job to buy something I really wanted, and instead of hearing that they were proud of me, my parents said it was good practice because I would have to take care of myself in life. Back then, I did not fully understand what they meant. But over time, the message became clear. Kyle was the investment, and I was the backup plan, the one expected to figure things out without help. When high school came, the pattern only grew stronger. Kyle skipped classes and spent time chasing whatever new interest caught his attention that month. But our parents always defended him, saying he was just creative and needed space to find his path. Meanwhile, I focused on my grades, worked small jobs after school, and tried to stay out of trouble, hoping that if I proved myself responsible enough, maybe they would finally notice. But the recognition never came. And eventually, I stopped expecting it. The moment that truly changed everything came when we both started talking about the future. I had dreams of going to college and building a career that would allow me to be independent, while Kyle talked about big plans that changed every few weeks. Our parents listened to him with excitement and promised they would support whatever he decided, while I was reminded that life was hard and learning to struggle would make me stronger. When I turned 18, that difference became impossible to ignore. Our parents proudly announced they were paying for Kyle to attend an expensive college program, even though his grades barely qualified him, while at the same time they told me I needed to start thinking about how I would support myself through school and life because they believed independence would be good for me. Hearing those words felt like the final confirmation of something I had suspected for years. I was not the child they were planning a future around. I was the one expected to quietly step aside and handle everything on my own. So that is exactly what I did. After finishing high school, I packed my belongings, found a small place to live, and started building a life without relying on them. I worked part-time jobs, took classes whenever I could afford them, and slowly began learning how to survive on my own. It was not easy, and there were many nights when I questioned whether leaving had been the right decision. But deep down, I also felt something new, a sense of freedom that I had never experienced inside that house, because for the first time, my success or failure depended only on my choices, not on whether someone else believed in me or not. Years passed, and I heard occasional updates about Kyle through relatives, stories about new opportunities, failed plans, and more chances given by our parents, who never seemed to lose faith in him. While my own life moved quietly forward step by step without their involvement, I stopped expecting phone calls, stopped waiting for apologies, and stopped trying to earn approval that was never going to come. What I did not realize at the time was that the same decisions that once pushed me Out of that house would one day bring my parents back to my door in a way none of us ever expected after leaving home at 18. I stepped into a world that felt both terrifying and strangely freeing. Because for the first time, every choice in my life was mine alone. I did not have parents paying my bills or guiding my future, but I also no longer had to live in the shadow of a brother who always seemed to come first. My early years on my own were far from easy. I worked whatever jobs I could find, sometimes two at the same time, just to afford rent, groceries, and basic necessities during the day. I attended community college classes, trying to move slowly toward a degree, even though I could only take a few courses at a time. Because of the cost, there were many nights when I came home exhausted from work, only to spend hours studying, while wondering if all the effort would eventually lead somewhere better. But each small achievement gave me a little more confidence that I could build something stable with enough persistence. Over time, I became better at balancing work and school, learning how to manage my limited money and how to plan ahead so that unexpected problems would not completely destroy my progress. Those lessons were difficult, but they shaped the way I approached every opportunity that came later. Eventually, I began helping a small local shop manage their online sales because they needed someone who understood computers and digital platforms. It started as a simple side task, but I discovered that I was actually good at organizing products, handling customer messages, and improving the way businesses presented themselves online. Soon, that small task turned into something bigger. Other local companies heard about the help I provided and asked if I could do the same thing for them. Before long, I realized that what began as a small favor was slowly becoming the foundation of a real career. I started learning more about online marketplaces, marketing strategies, and digital management, spending late nights researching ways to improve my skills. Even without formal training, the work kept growing, and over the years I built a small business that helped local companies manage their online stores. While it was not a glamorous success story, it provided something I had always wanted: stability, independence, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that everything I achieved came from my own effort. During those years, my connection with my parents became almost non-existent. We rarely spoke, and when we did, the conversations were brief and distant, as if we were relatives rather than family members. I stopped trying to explain my life to them, because the few times I had attempted it, their attention quickly shifted back to Kyle, who was still the center of their world. According to the occasional updates I heard through extended family, Kyle continued chasing new ideas and opportunities that sounded exciting at first, but rarely lasted very long. He moved from one plan to another, trying different business ventures, jobs, and investments. But nothing seemed to stick. Each time something failed, our parents were there to support him financially, emotionally, and sometimes even legally if a situation became complicated. Relatives often described him as someone who just needed one big break, while I quietly wondered how many chances a person could receive before being expected to stand on their own. But I kept those thoughts to myself, because I had already learned that questioning the family dynamic only created more conflict. Instead, I focused on maintaining distance and protecting the life I was slowly building for myself. As the years passed, my small business became stable enough that I could finally breathe without constantly worrying about the next bill. I moved into a better apartment, hired a part-time assistant, and allowed myself to believe that the difficult years had actually been leading somewhere meaningful. Even though my relationship with my parents remained distant, I no longer felt the same pain or need for their approval. I had created a peaceful routine, surrounded by supportive clients, friends, and coworkers who respected the work I had done to reach that point. Life was not perfect, but it felt balanced in a way my childhood never had, and for a long time it seemed like the past would simply remain in the past, with my parents continuing to support Kyle while I lived my independent life far away from their decisions. That fragile sense of distance lasted until the day my phone rang with a message from someone I had not heard from in years. A message that would pull me back into the family story. I thought I had finally left behind one evening, after finishing a long day of work, I noticed a message on my phone from a number I recognized. Immediately, even though years had passed, since we last spoke, it was my mother. And for a moment, I simply stared at the screen, unsure if I should even open it. Our conversations had been so rare that seeing her name again felt strange, almost like hearing from someone I used to know in another life. Curiosity eventually won, and I read the message expecting something short and polite, but the tone was unusual. It started with simple questions about how I was doing and where I was living now, as if she were trying to rebuild a connection that had slowly faded over the years. At first, I assumed it was just one of those occasional attempts families make to reconnect after long periods of silence, so I responded carefully, keeping my answers neutral and brief. But as the conversation continued, something about her messages felt different. There was a nervous urgency behind her words, as if she were trying to approach a subject she did not know how to explain. After a few more exchanges, she finally mentioned Kyle, and the moment his name appeared, I felt a familiar tension return, because throughout my life, his name had almost always been followed by some new story or problem. She explained that Kyle had been working on several business ideas over the past few years, and according to her, he believed he had finally found opportunities that would lead to serious success. Apparently, those plans involved investing money, borrowing funds, and partnering with people who promised big returns. At first, everything sounded exciting, and my parents had supported him the same way they always had, by helping financially and encouraging him to keep chasing his dreams. But as she continued explaining the situation, the excitement faded quickly. It turned out that many of those ventures had not worked the way Kyle expected. Some partnerships fell apart, others never produced profits, and a few turned out to be far riskier than anyone realized. The money he borrowed began piling up into serious debt, and because our parents had co-signed certain agreements or helped secure loans, the financial pressure slowly spread to them as well. Hearing all of this left me with a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt sympathy, because no one wants to hear that their family is struggling. But another part of me could not ignore the pattern that had existed for years. Kyle chasing big ideas, our parents protecting him, and everyone believing that the next attempt would somehow fix everything. My mother explained that at first they believed the situation would resolve itself once Kyle found another opportunity, but instead the debts continued growing, interest accumulated, and the people expecting repayment became less patient over time. Eventually, the problem reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. Bills that were once manageable started threatening their savings, and the house they had lived in for decades was now tied to financial obligations connected to Kyle's decisions. As I listened to the full explanation, I realized something that had never happened before. The system that always protected Kyle was finally collapsing under its own weight. The constant second chances, the endless support, and the belief that he would eventually succeed had created a situation no one could easily escape. For a long moment, I did not know what to say, because the conversation felt like stepping back into a story I had left years ago. My life had moved in a completely different direction, while theirs seemed trapped in the same cycle that once pushed me away. My mother eventually admitted that they were struggling more than they had expected, and that the stress had begun affecting every part of their lives. She did not immediately ask for anything directly, but the way she described their situation made the unspoken meaning obvious. They had reached a point where they no longer knew how to solve the problem on their own. After years of distance and silence, the family that once expected nothing from me was now reaching out again, not to celebrate something positive, but because the choices they made had led them into a crisis they could not handle alone. As the conversation ended, I sat quietly, thinking about everything I had just heard, realizing that the past I thought was finished had suddenly returned. And this time it was bringing a decision I never expected to face. A few days after that conversation, I agreed to meet my parents in person, because even though our relationship had been distant for years, part of me still wanted to understand the situation fully. We chose a quiet cafe halfway between where they lived and where I worked, and as I walked inside, I felt a strange mixture of emotions memories from my childhood, blended with the reality that we had barely spoken in a long time. When I finally saw them sitting at a table near the window, the first thing I noticed was how tired they looked. The confidence they once carried when talking about Kyle's future seemed replaced by worry and exhaustion. We greeted each other politely, but the conversation quickly moved to the reason we were there. My parents began explaining everything in much greater detail than they had through messages. They told me that Kyle had convinced them several years earlier that he had discovered opportunities that could lead to large profits if he had the right financial support. He had talked about partnerships, investments, and fast-growing markets that sounded impressive to people who trusted him. And because our parents had always believed in him, they agreed to help him get started. At first, the amounts of money involved were not small, but they believed the risks were manageable. They used savings, helped him secure loans, and even guaranteed certain agreements because they believed it was only a matter of time before his ideas succeeded. However, the success never came. Some projects failed quickly, while others dragged on long enough to create even larger losses. Each time, Kyle assured them that the next plan would recover everything, and for a while they continued trusting him because that was the role they had always played in his life. But eventually, the debts became impossible to ignore. Lenders wanted repayment, partners demanded answers, and the financial pressure that once belonged only to Kyle had spread directly to our parents because their names were connected to many of the agreements. As they described the situation piece by piece, the full weight of the problem became clear. They were now facing the possibility of losing the home they had lived in for decades, and the stress of that reality had changed the way they looked at everything. My mother admitted that they had hoped things would improve before reaching this point, but now they felt trapped by decisions they made out of loyalty and belief in their son. While listening to them, I felt old memories resurfacing, the years of feeling invisible, the times when my own struggles were treated as lessons I needed to handle alone, and the constant reminders that Kyle's future mattered more than mine. It was difficult to sit there and hear them talk about responsibility and consequences when those ideas had rarely applied to him before. Eventually, my father explained that they believed I might be in a position to help now that I had built a stable career. They did not demand anything directly, but the expectation behind their words was clear. They hoped I might have the financial ability to rescue the family from the situation Kyle had created. Hearing that request forced me to confront emotions I had spent years trying to move past. Part of me wanted to protect the life I had built through hard work and independence, while another part still felt the complicated pull of family history. I thought about the years I spent learning how to survive without their support, and how those experiences shaped the person I had become. Sitting there in that quiet cafe, I realized that whatever decision I made would define the future of our relationship more than anything that happened before, because for the first time, the roles had reversed. The child who was once expected to manage everything alone was now the one holding the power to decide whether the family that overlooked her would receive help or face the consequences of the choices they made long ago. And as the silence stretched across the table, I understood that my answer would surprise them in ways they had never considered. As I sat there listening to my parents describe the situation and the pressure they were under, I realized that the decision in front of me was not only about money, but about the pattern that had shaped our entire family for decades. The easiest thing in that moment might have been to simply agree to help them pay the debts and make the problem disappear. But deep down, I knew that doing that would only continue the same cycle that had created the situation in the first place. For years, Kyle had been protected from the consequences of his choices, while our parents sacrificed more and more to keep his plans alive. And every time someone rescued him, it gave him another reason to believe that the next risk would somehow work out without him needing to change anything. I also thought about my own life and the years I spent learning how to stand on my own without anyone stepping in to fix my problems. Those experiences were difficult, but they forced me to become responsible, careful, and realistic about the decisions I made. If someone had constantly solved everything for me, I might have ended up repeating the same mistakes that were now threatening my parents' security. Realizing this helped me understand that helping them did not necessarily mean paying for the damage Kyle had created. When I finally spoke, I explained that I cared about their situation and did not want to see them lose their home or their sense of stability, but I could not take responsibility for debts that came from choices I had no part in making. I told them that if Kyle wanted to change the direction of his life, he would need to face the reality of those decisions, instead of expecting someone else to erase them. My parents looked surprised because for most of their lives, they had assumed I would quietly accept whatever role they placed on me. But this time I was speaking as someone who had built a different life, one based on boundaries and accountability. Instead of simply offering money, I told them I was willing to help in another way. I could review their finances, help them create a plan to manage the debts, and show them ways to protect what remained of their savings and property. But that plan would only work if Kyle was willing to take responsibility for his actions and participate honestly in solving the problem rather than searching for another quick opportunity that might create even bigger losses. At first, the idea seemed difficult for them to accept because it challenged the habits they had followed for years. However, as the conversation continued, something slowly shifted. They began acknowledging that constantly rescuing Kyle had not helped him grow into the responsible person they believed he would become. It had simply delayed the moment when he needed to face the results of his choices. Over the following weeks, we continued discussing practical steps, reviewing paperwork, and looking for ways to restructure the financial obligations so that the damage could be controlled. While Kyle was forced to confront the reality of the situation himself, it was not an easy process, and there were moments when frustration resurfaced. But gradually, my parents began seeing the situation more clearly than they had before. For the first time, they spoke about fairness and balance within the family, recognizing that the expectations placed on me had been very different from the ones placed on Kyle. Our relationship did not suddenly become perfect, and the past could not be erased, but there was a new sense of honesty between us that had never existed before. Kyle eventually had to make difficult decisions about his own future without relying on another rescue, and whether those choices would lead him toward real responsibility remained uncertain. But one thing had finally changed: the pattern that defined our family for so long no longer controlled the direction of my life. Sometimes the most important lesson a family can learn is that love does not mean protecting someone from every consequence. True support often comes from allowing people to face reality and grow from it, even when that process is uncomfortable. And by standing firm in that belief, I was able to protect the life I built while giving my parents a chance to rebuild their own understanding of responsibility and fairness within our family.